I was in town the day the statue burned. I remember the light that morning, thin, silver, like a knife through cloud, and how the people on Main Street moved slower than usual, as if they had already been told something terrible would happen and were only waiting for it to arrive. The county fair flags were still there from last week, limp and dirty. The church bells had not rung. You could smell grilled corn from the diner down on Elm in the slow, harmless rot of late summer. Then we saw the burst of smoke from the hill behind St. Agnes, and everything changed. They found the statue at dawn, half charred, the paint blistered, the delicate face of the Virgin blackened like coal. Someone had tried to hide the damage with flowers, but the petals looked ridiculous against ash. An old woman on the porch across from the church prayed out loud, not whispering, and tears cut clean tracks down her sun-weathered cheeks. People said it was a hate crime. People said it was the act of a crazy man. What nobody said at first was why. And in a town that keeps its reasons for everything, that silence laid heavier than the smoke. Within hours, there was a face in the news cameras. Ahmed Rahman, 37, who'd come here 6 years before with a duffel bag and very few words of English. He worked nights at the packing plant, mended fences for people with too much land and too little time, and in the winter, he shoveled driveways for anyone who tipped him a little too much. He kept to himself mostly, with a small mosque on the edge of town where the men would gather for Friday prayers. Most of us would pass him on the sidewalk and nod, the way you do in towns like ours, acknowledgement without invitation. When they put Ahmed's name under the burned statue on the evening news, I felt the air in my chest shift, like the first page of the book you know you shouldn't read. Before we continue, if you want a prayer, leave a comment with your name and the names of your relatives. Our pastor will pray for every name you write. If this story gives you chills, please like and subscribe so you don't miss future true feeling tales like this. Hit the bell, tell a friend, and come back. We tell these stories for the quiet hours when the lights go down. I'm a reporter by trade and a neighbor by accident. I grew up 2 towns over. My mother still makes pies for the school bake sale and knows everyone's birthdays by heart. So when I went down to the church that day to ask questions, I was careful with my words. People were careful with theirs. They told me the obvious. Ahmed had been angry lately. He'd argued with his sister about money. He'd been drinking. He'd gone off on neighbors about noise. Small towns keep catalogs of a person's bad days, and within a week you can open a file on any soul. But some of the deeper things, the things that push a person over, stay hidden like a river under ice. In the first 5 days after the fire, the town filled with whispers and with petitions. A petition formed to repair the statue, another to raise the funds for a new one entirely. Candles multiplied on the church steps. Someone painted a makeshift sign that said, simply, "Mercy." The pastor, a man called Reverend Ellis with a voice like warm tea, stood under the church porch every morning and prayed aloud for peace. He also told me, quietly and directly, that anyone who left a name in the comments under the videos about the incident would have that name prayed for at the evening service. It's not about clicks, he said, blinking as if the idea embarrassed him. It's about names. Names carry weight. So if you want that prayer, again, leave your name and your relatives' names below. He means it. There is a part of Ahmed's story that made people flinch, a detail that some insisted explained his fury and others said did not excuse it. Ahmed had come to America after his wife died, following complications in childbirth back home. He'd lost 2 things in a row, a homeland and the face he loved. When he landed in our county, he was a man with pockets of grief and a faith so private it didn't announce itself. You could tell from the way he crossed himself before he left the mosque and the way he'd sometimes linger at the roadside shrine by the highway. Eyes on the road, as if talking to someone passing. Grief has a long memory, and sometimes it casts its own shadows. On the night he burned the statue, witnesses later said Ahmed walked past the church twice before he stopped. He stood in the gutter and watched the porch light blink. He propped a small gas can against the wall, struck a lighter, and in a single fluid motion set flame to a thing our town called sacred. He told a friend afterward, or so the friend told my neighbor, who told the pastor, who told me, that he was tired of being watched, tired of feeling like he had to apologize for his face or his prayers. He'd been insulted in the packing plant. A man on the street once spat at him. A boy had thrown a rock at his window when he refused to hand over money. Anger, if you bottle it, turns into something brittle and sharp. That night something in him broke. The next morning the town was on its knees, but not the kind you expect. They were on their knees under heavy coats and rainless skies, trying to figure out what to do next. The bishop sent a statement asking for forgiveness and reminding people that miracles and justice are not the same thing. The mosque overflowed with men who did not wish to be seen as the same as one angry act. Ahmed was arrested. Simple processing, handcuffs, the polite forms of law enforcing itself. And by noon the preacher had called for calm. Yet in the undercurrent, alongside official prayers and condemnations, there were stories that didn't belong in press releases. The way the night before the burning, an old woman dreamed of a bright woman standing in a white field, or how a boy on Maple Street's hair turned white at the roots for a week following the incident. You cannot catalog every small omen in a town without sounding silly, but when enough people tell the same small, shivering story, those whispers become a kind of history. I went to the mosque because I wanted to hear Ahmed's side, and because the imam there, a gentleman named Hassan with a laugh like a church bell, had agreed to speak if I promised to listen. Hassan did not excuse what happened. What happened to statue was wrong, he said, his hands folding and unfolding. Our faith teaches respect for others' houses of worship, just as we ask for respect for ours. But then he told me about the hollow places inside people, the losses that scrape them, and how sometimes when someone is crushed in one place, they try to break what they think the world will notice. Hassan spoke softly of compassion and consequence both, and when he mentioned that Ahmed had wept alone that night under a street lamp, I felt a weight shift, a little necessary humanizing that does not undo wrongdoing. Then something stranger began to thread through the town. Small misfortunes, like a row of pins knocked over. The dairy farm on Route 9 lost 3 calves in a single week to a sickness vets called nothing but bad luck. A peddler's truck stalled on the only road up to the hills. Its brakes failing, though it had just been checked. A young woman who'd been engaged for a year woke with a fever that would not break and went silent for days. People who wanted to read meaning into random sorrow found it here, and people who wanted a simpler answer said it was coincidence. But the more time passed, the more the narrative of the statue grew a shadow around it, and that shadow drew in even those who wanted only facts. 3 days after the burning, Ahmed had his court date moved up. He was a raw figure in the courthouse, beard untrimmed, and when I saw him, his eyes were not angry so much as hollowed out, like wells dried of water. He told the judge he wanted to plead guilty, to take the punishment, to make something right. The judge ordered an evaluation and set bail that Ahmed could not afford. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered with signs that read forgive and others that read punish. I watched a small girl hold a paper dove and weep because the world was suddenly very big and very complicated for her. The balance between justice and mercy tangled like a knotted rope. That same night, on a highway a few miles from town, a flatbed truck came through at dawn with headlights like a furnace. The driver swore later he did not see Ahmed step into the road, but witnesses described the scene as if it were in slow motion. Ahmed's arms lifted, a car's brakes screeched, and then a terrible, blinding collision. It happened in the thin, silver light I mentioned at the start, the light that seemed to cut through everything. Ahmed survived, barely. They flew him to the regional hospital with a skull fracture and broken bones. The news channels snapped into motion, and the town that had wanted to gather in judgment now gathered in prayer, each side rearranging their words to fit the image of a man with his life on a thin, jagged hinge. At the hospital, the machines were loud and mechanical, the way they always are. The whistle of oxygen, the steady beep of monitors, the soft clink of a tray. Reverend Ellis stood at the foot of Ahmed's bed with Imam Hassan at his side. 2 men who had not always agreed, but who had learned, in the face of something bigger than their arguments, how to stand together. "We will pray," Hassan said, and Ellis touched Ahmed's shoulder with a hand that smelled faintly of chalk and soap. I stood outside the sliding glass doors and took notes with fingers that trembled a little. The story had bent and turned, and now it lay in that room, fragile as glass and about to be tested for what it really was. The nurses said Ahmed's breathing was shallow, and the doctors were cautious. They used the word critical. I'd watched plenty of miracle stories on late-night shows where a figure bends and the universe repairs itself, but real hospitals move by rules. Medications, protocols, sterile gloves. The idea that something holy might happen here seemed improbable. Yet, late into the second night, when the ward nurse stepped out for coffee and the corridor hummed with the night's electric quiet, a soft rustle of cloth and the scent of lilies, impossible in a sterile room, threaded through. A young orderly swore he saw movement at the curtain and for a second thought someone had come in to check on Ahmed. He joked about hospital ghosts until his face went pale. "This is where I stop for now. Not because the story ends, but because the best thing that ever happens in a story like this is the moment when the world stops pretending to be ordinary. We are at the edge of that moment. Ahmed, on a hospital bed, his life measured in beeps and breaths. A town split between fury and pity. A pastor and an imam holding different prayers in the same small room. And somewhere just beyond the fluorescent lights, the possibility of something that cannot be measured or explained, mercy or consequence, or both, is leaning in. If you want to know what happened next, say the names you want prayed for in the comments, and when you're ready, tell me to go on. I went back to the hospital the next morning, and the fluorescent lights that usually felt clinical now seemed invasive, like eyes that never blink. The corridor smelled of bleach and coffee. People in scrubs moved with the practiced speed of those who see suffering every day and have learned to tuck the weight of it somewhere under their uniforms. In the waiting room, a woman sat with a bag of coins for the vending machine and rocked an infant who coughed like a bird. Someone muttered the word miracle like it was an accusation. When I pushed through the glass doors into Ahmed's room, the machines kept time like a small, stubborn choir. His skull was wrapped in white bandages. His face had the placid look of someone who had been pulled from a storm and set down in shallow water. He breathed, but his hands twitched as if fighting the memory of pain. The pastor and the imam had stayed through the night. Reverend Ellis held a paper cup of hospital coffee and spoke softly, while Imam Hassan read verses and prayers with a rhythm that folded around the room like a blanket. They would stand there for hours, two men from different homes of faith, agreeing on one thing, that a human life is worth more than any argument. Outside, the town kept changing its shape. People who wanted easy answers painted graffiti on the packing plant wall. Other people left lilies on a ruined statue's pedestal and prayed until their knees went numb. There were angry letters in the newspaper, and handwritten notes slid under the church's wooden door that smelled faintly of mothballs and the sea, someone's old stationery. An elderly man in a cap I knew only as Mr. Keene came down from his porch every day and stood with his cane on the sidewalk and looked toward the church and the mosque like he was waiting to see which way the weather would turn. Rumors grew like mold where there was damp. That Ahmed had been planning this for months, that he'd been radicalized, that he'd been insulted. Others swore he was a good man pushed over the brink by loneliness and humiliation. Neither story contained the whole truth. People like whole truths because whole truths fit on a poster. Real life tends to be messy and partial, stitched together from small hurts and louder defenses. Hospital staff began to whisper about small things that don't make it to the police report. A night orderly said he glimpsed a woman in pale clothing standing at the foot of Ahmed's bed, looking down at him with hands folded. He thought at first it was a piece of curtain or a trick of shadow. A nurse who had worked oncology for 20 years and had seen people wake from comas to speak languages they had never learned told her friend that, in the middle of her shift, she smelled lilies so strongly she went to ask a visitor if they had flowers. No one had. A janitor said he saw footprints on the floor by the bedside that ended at the curtain and did not continue. When asked, he refused to speak more than that, which in our town is the same as saying a prayer. It's tempting to call those things superstition. It's tempting to say people saw what they needed to see. But there is also a pattern to the small signs that made strangers meet each other on the corner and compare notes. A flock of sparrows circling a certain house night after night. A radio in a diner that stuck on the same hymn for an hour and then cut. A child's drawing that showed a woman with a halo standing by a hospital bed when none of the adults had mentioned halos to the child at all. When ordinary people begin to tell the same quiet story, it becomes harder to dismiss. The statue itself had a history I found by wandering into the church's dusty basement files and asking questions. It turned out the statue of the Virgin Mary had been carved by a woman named Josephine Keller in 1954, a seamstress from the next county who came after the war with 3 suitcases and a heart full of prayer. Josephine had worked nights and stayed in the church loft, stitching altar cloths and watching over the building when the storms came. People said she fashioned the statue after a face she remembered from a painting in her childhood church, a face of mercy and patience. She named the statue Our Lady of the Hill and refused to sign her work. She said, as people who pray to make amends often say, that it was not her, but something that moved through her hands. Old Mrs. Dalloway, whose memory is a museum of the town's private lives, told me Josephine once saved a child from drowning in the mill pond. The town had called it a brave woman's act. Josephine said later that she had been guided by a hand on her shoulder. You could call those things coincidence or faith, she told me, her voice brittle as the pages of a Bible. But either way, they change how we learn to live. That story, Josephine's hands at work, the statue that came from grief and thankfulness, made the burning feel like a violation beyond vandalism. That's partly why the town's anger felt so hot. It wasn't only a painted face that was damaged, it was a living history. For decades, parishioners had tied ribbons at the statue's base for safe travel, for babies born, for crops to come in. They had whispered secrets to the plaster and walked away lighter. The statue had become a place where people left parts of their sorrow, and when it burned, the sorrow had nowhere to go but back into the town. Threats came next like shadows at a window. Someone spray-painted slurs on the mosque's fence late one night. A brick flew through the mosque's front window while worshippers were inside. No one was hurt, but the glass lay like a shattered promise on the floor. Anonymous calls came to the pastor's house in the middle of the night, some begging for vengeance, some asking for forgiveness in the same breath. The mosque installed outdoor lights, and Reverend Ellis and Imam Hassan began to do walks together after evening prayers. The shoot the breeze kind of walk that is also an act of solidarity. I interviewed both men more than once and found in each a tired patience and a steady compassion. Reverend Ellis, who had once been a journalist himself, told me, "People want an enemy to fix their fear. But when you make an enemy of another person, you make an enemy of yourself too." Hassan, folding his hands as if to tie them around his own thoughts, said, "Justice should be blind. Yes, but mercy must have eyes." They were not easily reconciled on everything. They disagreed about the legalities of Ahmed's punishment and whether forgiveness should arrive before the law. But both agreed that a human life was not a headline. Meanwhile, Ahmed slept and shifted in that place between life and the possibility of it. Family came from out of state, a sister who had the same long nose and a mother who would not sit down without offering a blessing, and they moved around the room like people in a ship trying to find balance. They talked through clenched teeth about lawyers and what had been said and what could not be taken back. The sister cried quietly each time the monitor beeped, as if each sound could be a verdict. Children from the mosque left cards and drawings that said, simply, "Get well," and the edges were jagged from crayons. The pastor made the family coffee and sometimes sat with his head bowed for no one in particular. Then the dreams began to multiply, and not only in the hospital. A teenage boy who worked at the packing plant, who had once taunted Ahmed and then thrown himself into work with the kind of guilt that washes forward like water, dreamed of a woman in a white dress standing in his mother's backyard, hands full of rain, telling him to be kind. He woke up and cut his day short and went to the mosque to stand with Ahmed's friends and apologize. A farmer who had shouted for the police when he saw Ahmed in the fields that summer dreamt of crops bending, as if bowing, and woke with dirt under his nails. An elderly parishioner told me she'd been visited 3 nights in a row by the Virgin Mary, who held her by the wrist and said, "Pray for him." None of these dreams were identical, and yet they held the same note, a voice calling for mercy. Not every dream turned hearts. Some people hardened. There were those who said prayers for justice with their hands clenched like fists. There were small groups that met in shadows and said we must defend our own. A man who had seen his son tortured by addiction said he could not think of mercy when his pain was still raw. We are composite creatures, and our grief does not always have patience for other people's sorrow. On the 5th day after the crash, the town organized a vigil at the church. People came with candles and flashlights, with signs and with silence. The police closed off the block and let the crowd gather. Reverend Ellis stood on the church steps and asked for a moment of quiet that sounded like a benediction. Then, one by one, people stepped forward and told their stories, of the ways the statue had helped them, of what it meant to lose something familiar, and of what it felt like to be frightened of your neighbor. Ahmed's sister read a short letter, not a defense, but an explanation, in which she spoke of a man who had loved too little and lost too much, and for whom the world was sometimes a series of doors that would not open. During the vigil, an old song rose up from the crowd, soft at first, then with a chorus. Someone from the mosque had learned the tune and hummed along in a voice that sounded like reconciliation. The light from the candles mapped out faces and showed lines that time had carved on them. It was the kind of night where you could believe, just for an hour, that people might move past suspicion. After the vigil, an air of cautious truce settled, fragile, like ice on a pond in March. I thought then, perhaps foolishly, that the worst had passed. It was foolish because human stories rarely end as neatly as one hopes. The next day, a letter arrived at the pastor's office. It was unsigned. Inside was a small, thin object wrapped in paper, a scrap of something that smelled faintly of smoke. When Reverend Ellis opened it, he found a small coin with a hole in the middle and a note that said only, "Remember Josephine." The note reopened old arguments and new fears. It was as if someone wanted to remind the town that history had weight and that some things resist being put under glass. The coin's origin was unclear, but Mrs. Dalloway claimed she'd seen Josephine carry one like in her pocket. "People leave tokens for what they hope will keep them safe," she said. "You could take a token as comfort or a threat, depending on how much fear is in your hands." That night, in Ahmed's hospital room, the monitors were steady and his breathing even. The bandages had been changed, the swelling had gone down a little, and the doctors had moved from saying critical to saying guarded. The pastor and imam took turns by his bed, praying in their own voices, sometimes together and sometimes quietly alone. It felt like a small, trembling agreement to hold space for each other while the world argued. And then, as the ward settled and the night folded inward, something else happened that made everyone who saw it forget to breathe. A patient across the hall from Ahmed, an elderly woman with a thin, papery face and a history of heart disease, woke from a sleep that seemed ordinary and began to tell the nurse about a woman who came to her bed and smoothed her hair. She described the woman's dress as if it were made from candlelight, and when the nurse bent down in curiosity, the woman's pulse beat like a drum. The woman's daughter, who had been dozing in a chair, rubbed her eyes and said she had smelled lilies as she slept. The daughter had not brought flowers. Meanwhile, in Ahmed's room, the nurse on duty, a steady woman named Marta who had seen enough to keep her wonder small, noticed the curtain at the foot of the bed lifting without wind. She thought at first it was a draft from the air conditioning. She saw, too, that the four-line pulsed in a rhythm that made sense and then, for a single breath, slowed as if someone had cupped it in their hand. She held her breath and did not move. She later told me she could not explain it, and that she left the room to let the two men, pastor and imam, finish their prayers because somehow this felt like a thing meant to be witnessed quietly. By dawn, the hospital hummed with new talk. The stories spread like a scent. People who had not slept on a night shift looked pale and untried. The old woman across the hall had spoken of a hand that touched her head and of words whispered that were not in her language, but that filled her with a peace as if someone else had paid a debt she did not know existed. No one yet said the word that would make this a miracle for some and a delusion for others. They simply told the small facts that would later swell into legend. And then, as if a cut had been opened to let the story pour through, the lights in the corridor flickered and a hush fell like glass. At Ahmed's bedside, the pastor and imam were silent, eyes closed, palms together. The machines continued their steady song. The hospital clock kept time. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. I stand here, typing the next line with my hands, still a little cold from the hospital's air and the memory of that room. There is a moment in a story when everything leans toward revelation, when the crowd hushes and even the birds stop. We are at that edge now. The town has walked through grief and anger and now stands between the sharpness of consequence and the warmth of mercy. If you want to keep listening, if you want to hear the thing that happened between dawn and the shutting of the night, tell me to go on. There is a woman coming into this scene, a presence that will change how the town names what has happened. The next part will not be easy for anyone who keeps their faith in tidy boxes. It will ask us questions about forgiveness, punishment, and whether a person can be remade. The next part will tell you what the nurses saw when they swore to be honest about the smell of lilies, and what Ahmed said when he opened his eyes. Tell me to continue, and I will tell the rest. By the time the sun lifted its pale head over the hospital on that last morning, the corridor felt smaller and somehow more honest. The machines still sang, but voices had found their way back into the tiny room where Ahmed lay. People had been saying prayers for days, names scribbled on paper, whispered in pews and on prayer rugs, typed into comment sections with the same careful hope. If you want a prayer now, leave your name and the names of your relatives below, and Reverend Ellis will pray for them at tonight's service. When the nurses pulled aside the curtain that morning, they expected slow, ordinary things. Infection ruled out, swelling reduced, a body inching back from the edge. What they found instead was a quiet the way a held breath becomes a soundless thing. Ahmed's face, bruised and swollen, had a look that was neither asleep nor awake, but something like listening. His hands trembled, but not with pain. Someone in the room smelled lilies again, and nurses exchanged looks the way people exchange proof when proof refuses to be simple. Reverend Ellis and Imam Hassan were there, as they had been night after night, their presence a hinge in the hospital's door. They had argued and reconciled and argued again in small, human ways, but they came together that morning with a shared urgency. The two men knelt at Ahmed's bedside with the slow respect of people who knew how to be still. The imam recited a verse in Arabic that hung in the room like a prayer flag. The pastor whispered a psalm, syllables made of careful breath. They had promised each other to stand there until whatever this was decided to move on. And in the middle of their stillness, the air shifted. It started in the small things. A drop of water left on the rail like a pearl. A warm wind passing through though no windows were open. Light changing shape on the ceiling. Then there was the sound, not a voice, but the hush of fabric moving as if someone adjusted their dress. A nurse, Marta, who carried the experience of 40 graveyard shifts in her bones, laid a hand against Ahmed's forehead and felt something like a cool wash. She later said she tasted salt and saw, for the length of a fish's blink, an outline like a woman leaning over him with her hands cupped. She could not say how long she held that vision, because time in those rooms has a way of folding. The woman's face, and it was a face in every telling, was described differently by different people. Soft and plain by some, impossibly young by others, older and very compassionate by still others. Nearly everyone mentioned a kind of exhausting mercy in her eyes, like someone who had stood at the foot of too many beds to count. The janitor said he saw a faint impression on the sheet near Ahmed's feet, like a footprint that warmed the mattress. A young orderly swore he saw a hand at the foot of the bed, pale and gentle, smoothing the covers. None of these witnesses had ever met each other before that night. None had planned to tell the same story. But when independent stories sing the same melody, they become harder to ignore. What followed was small and then astonishing. The monitors that had chirped an alarmless alarm for days began to settle to a softer rhythm. The doctor said later, in the frank language of medicine, that Ahmed's vitals had stabilized in a way not explained by the medications. He had no fever where he had had one. The swelling in his brain, the thing that threatened to unmake him, decreased faster than any of the scans should allow. A nurse checked his pupils and found them tracking the light. And another nurse, who had seen miracles and fakes in equal measure, simply sat down on a nearby chair and cried without sound. At some point in that slow morning, someone, perhaps Reverend Ellis, perhaps the imam, reached for Ahmed's hand. He opened his eyes and looked at the two men who had stood faithfully by him. What he said first was not an apology in the clear form the town required. He whispered a name, the name of the woman who had carved the statue years before, Josephine Keller. And then he said, broken and immediate, she came. She sat by me. She washed my face. His voice was small but steady. He did not speak of words in a language he did not know. He spoke instead of hands and of light and of something that had taken his breath and made it holy. His recovery did not happen like in the movies where someone gets up and walks away. It was more like a plant being coaxed back to green. Slow leaves, then stronger stems. Over the next days, his fever abated, the fracture on his skull, once a reason to fear the worst, showed signs of knitting, and where his heart had been a hole, people said there grew a quiet that suggested room for something else. He asked to speak to the pastor and the imam together. That meeting in the little hospital chapel became the town's fulcrum. There, with sunlight in the stained glass and a cheap radio playing low, Ahmed spoke in a voice that scraped like gravel but held. He apologized in one long breath for the statue, for the way he had hurt a town that had not deserved such harm. He talked about the nights his grief announced itself like a storm, about a wife whose laughter lived in pictures, about how some nights people had made him small for being foreign. When he spoke of the moment the woman appeared, he cried, and the men around him did what men do. Some of them wiped their eyes and others refused to, but the room felt smaller and truer for the telling. The miracle, as people named it, began to change things. Some of the harshest critics, a man whose son had died in an accident in another county and who had wanted law to be absolute, found his voice rearrange itself in front of Ahmed. He said, simply, that he believed in consequence but not in the hollowing of a human soul. Others remained angry. There were still those who could not forgive an act so visible and vulgar. The town had not done a complete turn overnight, and it never would. History does not always let people off the hook that easily. There was a legal reckoning. The county prosecutor decided not to drop charges. Law and faith are different kinds of justice, but he offered a chance for restorative justice to be considered as part of sentencing. People from both the church and the mosque stood up in court and spoke about Ahmed not as a monster or a saint, but as a person with a life that had splintered. A woman from the packing plant who had once been too afraid to sit beside him on the bus took the stand to say she forgave him because she had been afraid too. The judge, a quiet man who had seen more broken stories than he would admit, listened and then said a sentence that included community service at both the church and the mosque, counseling and restitution that would help rebuild what had been broken. It was not mercy without consequence. It was mercy that learned to be honest about limits. Outside of the courtroom, the town rebuilt the statue. A sculptor in a neighboring county volunteered to recarve the face from photographs of old programs and Josephine's old sewing sketches. The new statue stood on a repaired plinth, its hands outstretched, and the first time people pressed notes and ribbons there it filled with a kind of messy gratitude. Children were allowed to help paint small sections, wearing gloves and protective smocks. When Ahmed saw the new figure, months later, with a scarf around his neck and the hospital's ghost left behind, he walked up on his own 2 feet and stood before it. He did not put his hands where others did. He simply knelt and touched the hem of his coat to the stone as if to reconnect with a place he had once severed. Something else happened that was less visible, but perhaps more lasting. The pastor and the imam agreed to lead a shared service one Sunday. Not a sermon of easy answers, but a time when people of different faiths could come together and tell the full, inconvenient truth about anger and grief and the ways both can corrupt. The service was noisy and imperfect, with children crying and an elderly woman singing an off-key hymn no one had heard in years. People who had never exchanged more than nods stood side by side. Some walked out halfway through, unsure, but most stayed. It did not fix everything. The mosque still had to repair its windows. The packing plant still argued about who had been wrong. But the gesture, the 2 men leading together, shifted how people could imagine themselves living with one another. Ahmed himself became, slowly and without fanfare, someone who tried to give back. He mopped floors at the church and shoveled the elderly's walks in winter. He taught a little Arabic to local children whose parents wanted them to understand the Quranic phrases they heard at school. Sometimes he stood at the statue and looked like a man talking to a friend. He did not become a saint. He still had fits of sorrow. He still battled the nights when old grief seemed bigger than the morning. But he learned to carry his life differently, with more humility and a new willingness to keep his grief from touching others. The town changed, too, in quieter ways. Folks started to ask how someone's noon was going when they passed on the street, and not because they wanted to be seen as kind, but because they wanted to matter to someone. The bakery on Main took to giving a free pie now and then to families who could not pay. The school held a poster contest about kindness, and the winning drawings, bright childlike things, hung from the church rafters for months. None of these things erased what had happened, but they made a smaller world possible where people could try again. And yet the story kept its edge. Memory is not the same as forgiveness. There were nights when the statue's lamp would go out and someone would relight it with hands that trembled. There were letters received by the pastor that accused him of betrayal. There were nights when Ahmed walked the town in a fog of shame and came home to find the front stoop glassed with eggs and not lilies. People are not entirely rational about the spiritual. We keep an inside pocket of fear for emergencies we cannot name. Once, months after the miracle, a child came up to Ahmed at the grocery and handed him a coin with a hole in the middle, the same kind that had once been sent to the pastor. Ahmed took it and held it until it warmed to his palm, and when the child asked him why he looked so tired, he simply smiled and said, "I am learning." He walked away with the coin, kept somewhere like a promise. I tell you this not to give you the tidy ending a story craves, but to show you what mercy looks like when it is messy and human. A broken thing that people try to put back together with hands that tremble, a town that learns its own weakness, and a man who is not forgiven so much as asked to pick up the pieces. If anything in this tale rings true to you, the smell of lilies, the hush of a hospital corridor, the way people can be both cruel and kind, then you know how close we live to each other's falling. We live in the small economies of apology and care. Thank you for listening this far. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe so you won't miss future stories that live in the gray between wonder and grief. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that mercy can arrive when we least expect it. And don't forget, leave a comment with your name and the names of your relatives if you'd like Reverend Ellis to pray for you. He keeps every list with quiet hands. I'll leave you with one last image. The statue at dusk, its new face washed in gold, children's names tucked like small flags at its base, and Ahmed, not a saint, not a monster, but a man, standing a respectful distance away, hands folded as if in a prayer for himself and for the town that had almost torn itself apart. The light dimmed and the lamplight took over. The town exhaled. And somewhere, perhaps, Mercy folded its hands and watched.